So I hope everyone is in good form for this session. It's centred around the environment and especially the key areas of water quality and biodiversity. Farmers are faced with so many competing challenges, whether that's nitrates or emissions or profitability or climate change, and which is the most important. But it's hard to prioritise what is most important. But today, it's probably we should focus on learning as much as we can in the areas that we're probably a little bit poorer on. So the aim of the session to give an insight into the current state of play and the direction of travel with relation to the key areas, and also to give the practical real-life experience of a highly efficient dairy farm which is Shane, and Shane is already ahead of the curve in increasing the value of natural capital on his farm. So first up we have Dr. Daire O Huallachain, a senior researcher at Johnstown Castle, and he specialises in the area of ecology and water quality. Darra is a passionate advocate for both farming and the environment, and we're really fortunate to have him with us today. So big round of applause.
So, thank you very much, Gillian, and thank you to the Positive Farmers for the invitation to present today. It's very encouraging, as someone who's been working in this space for over 20 years now, so I'm feeling old, that biodiversity is becoming increasingly mainstreamed and increasingly integrated in environmental and agricultural conferences such as this. So the presentation is on agricultural biodiversity policies and practices, so my side is going to focus more on the policy side. Shane is going to follow up like a tag team with some of the more practical elements that he and his farm at home have been implementing. So as a background, well, what is biodiversity? Biodiversity or ecology or wildlife or nature, it's all species, all animals, all plants, and all the habitats in which they live. So it's all living creatures are part of our biodiversity and the habitats in which they live. And unfortunately, we are witnessing significant declines in biodiversity globally. So recently, over the last 2 or 3 years, the UN Global Assessment on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services highlighted these significant declines in biodiversity. Globally, each year we have this Living Planet report, again highlighting these declines in biodiversity. 1 million species face extinction as a direct result of human activities. We have keystone indicators. We have species such as the polar bear, which are threatened with global extinction and draw a lot of attention. Closer to home, we are also witnessing the same challenges from a biodiversity point of view as we're seeing globally. About 3 years ago, Ireland was one of the first countries to declare a climate and biodiversity emergency, not necessarily because things are worse in this country than they are elsewhere, but it highlights, I suppose, the increasing awareness that society had in relation to the challenges associated with biodiversity loss, but also that biodiversity and climate are intrinsically linked. More recently, last year, we would have seen movements in relation to establishment of a citizens' assembly on biodiversity loss, and again, recommendations coming from that are going to be implemented into policy at some stage over the coming years. We also have our own polar bear species here in Ireland, our own species that are threatened with extinction as a result of human activities. Things such as our corncrake, which would have been common on agricultural land at the times of our grandparents now, as opposed to as our parents. So, decline in our species, what does that actually look like? Well, some of the declines we're seeing nationally, about a 33% decline in some of our butterfly species, for example. We've heard a lot of talk about pollinators in recent years, and again, about half our pollinators, we've about 100 different bee species, and about half of them have undergone significant declines in recent years. Some of our farmland bird species, as I mentioned, the corncrake, declined from about 10,000 species, or 10,000 individuals, down to about 120 now, over the last 50 years. Things like the curlew have undergone a cataclysmic decline over the last 20 years. Since policy has been enforced, we're still seeing massive declines in these farmland species. So again, 98%. And these are only some of the indicator species. There are other species that are also significant declines. So what are these drivers of our biodiversity declines? What's causing biodiversity decline nationally and globally? So again, the UN Global Assessment highlighted some of the chief drivers of biodiversity decline globally. Things such as exploitation of species, so a significant driver maybe of decline of marine species and decline overfishing, for example. Climate change, internationally and nationally, is having a significant impact on some of our migratory species as weather patterns are changing, but also it's having an impact on some of our habitats as we are getting drier summers and wetter winters. It's impacting on streams, for example, and various other habitats, and then in turn impacting on the species that are dependent on those habitats. Things like pollution, significant driver of biodiversity decline, particularly from some of our freshwater systems. So we would have heard talk earlier, and Aoife will speak about it later, about the drivers of freshwater systems, so too much nitrogen or phosphorus or sediment, all of which are pollutants when there's too many of them getting into our water courses. Alien invasive species, again, significant challenge in this country, species such as grey squirrel or mink or some of these plant species impacting on our own native species. And they're all fine. They're the four of the chief drivers of biodiversity decline. But the most significant one, internationally and nationally, is land use change. And this has the largest negative impact on ecosystems and on the species dependent on those ecosystems. And we may have mental images of what land use change may look like at a global scale. Conversion, for example, of virgin rainforest for soy plantation or for palm oil production. But closer to home, we are also experiencing land use change, for example, upland heath, which is an important habitat in its own right, in this instance, being converted to more intensive or semi-improved grassland. Again, impacting on those species that were dependent on upland traditional heath. So biodiversity decline, so what? Okay, curlew has declined down to whatever, last 50 or 100 individuals. Corncrake has more or less disappeared. Many of our butterfly species and bee species, so what? So the way I kind of look at it is, the next time you're on an aeroplane and you're sitting in a window seat and you look out and you're looking along the wing of the aeroplane and you see there's thousands of rivets holding this wing of an aeroplane together. And you're flying along, and next thing one of the rivets falls out. You're not going to be overly alarmed. There's still thousands of rivets holding that wing together. And then you fly along and you hit a bit of turbulence and maybe 10 rivets fall out. Now you're getting a little bit concerned, but you're still not going to press that emergency button because you're hugely concerned. And rivets keep falling, and you get more and more concerned until you get to the stage where the next rivet that falls out results in collapse or in disaster. And it's the same with ecosystems. Its species and habitats play an important role in ecosystem functioning. And we can afford to lose some species because other species will fill that gap or will fill that niche. But we don't fully know enough about our ecosystems to see, well, what can we afford to lose and what can we not afford to lose? And this is also true for our agricultural systems. And because of the role that biodiversity plays in land management, for example, and the key role that biodiversity plays in land management. So we're getting more and more familiar with the role of plants, for example, and legumes, and the role that they play in grassland production as they fix atmospheric nitrogen and making it available for grassland species and grow more grass. So that's one key service that biodiversity is playing. We're also familiar with and becoming more and more familiar with some of the below-ground services that are being undertaken by earthworms, for example, acting like soil engineers, hydrating the soil, recycling nutrients throughout the soil, aerating the soil, a key service being produced by biodiversity. Charles Darwin said, without the work of this humble creature, agriculture as we know it would be difficult, if not wholly impossible. Other species, such as our pollinators, again, significant declines, play a key role for many plant species in pollination, more so important for horticulture, for example, and some of our arable crops that are dependent on pollinating services. Albert Einstein said, if the bee disappeared off the surface of the globe, man would have 4 years left to live. Now, Einstein was a physicist and not a biologist, so he's a little bit extreme in his case there, but it shows the direction of travel. It's got to the stage in certain parts of South Korea, for example, where they have no pollinators. They must pay people to go out with a bucket, a brush and pollen and pollinate apple trees. Now that's not sustainable because ecosystem is no longer functioning the way that ecosystem should have functioned. Other species such as bees or beetles play an important role in biocontrol and are now becoming increasingly important in the absence of neonicotinoids and things like that in relation to parts of our integrated pest management. So these are the roles that biodiversity plays from a land management point of view. So as a result of biodiversity decline, not only are we losing the species and habitats, and it's a shame that we are losing them because it's nice to have them, but it's also important that by losing these species and habitats that we're also losing the associated ecosystem services that these species and habitats deliver. Services such as provisioning service, production of food and fuel. Services such as regulatory services. We're increasingly seeing the importance of these habitats, bog habitats, woodland habitats in relation to climate mitigation, in relation to carbon sequestration and storage, or for example, bogs in relation to flood mitigation. Natural services, ecosystem services being delivered by biodiversity. Other services include cultural services. People like wildlife. People like outdoor spaces, be it for recreational purposes, be it for aesthetic purposes, be it for shooting or hunting, or the variety of other reasons people use outdoor spaces. And again, supporting services associated with biodiversity, pollination, nutrient cycling, and some of those that we mentioned earlier. So against this backdrop, we're seeing a variety of pieces of policy aimed to try and reverse this decline of biodiversity. That's been going on for decades. Some of the ecological policies have been there since over 40 years. Birds Directive, 40 years, 43 years now in existence, and we're still seeing significant declines in bird numbers. Habitats directives, those special areas of conservation, been in place for about 30 years, still seeing declines in some of these habitats. More and more importantly, as agriculture is the dominant land use in Ireland, agricultural policy, which incorporates elements of biodiversity, is becoming increasingly important if we want to preserve some of these habitats, the species, and the ecosystem services associated with them. So we're seeing last iteration of CAP. We saw greening as a kind of dipping its toe into the CAP policy. More recently, with the latest iteration of CAP, we're seeing greater emphasis on biodiversity in the Common Agricultural Strategic Plans, and we'll speak about that in a second. So how has our ecological policy fared? I should point out, I'm being pretty negative, so it's pretty bad for a positive farmers audience that I'm being so negative in this regard, but these, I suppose, are the facts. Some of the key messages. So about 2 or 3 years ago, the EPA collated various pieces of data in relation to how our state is performing, how the environmental state of the country is in relation to water and carbon and biodiversity. And from a biodiversity point of view, they focused in particular on our designated sites, our protected habitats, sites that are designated as SACs, special areas of conservation, or sites that are designated as SPAs, special protection areas, about 14% of the land area. Some of the key messages for our designated sites, designated under EU policy. The majority of our protected sites are of inadequate or bad status. I appreciate it's hard to see some of the figures up here, but it's about half, about 45 to 50% inadequate or bad status, and that the trend is declining. Again, continuously declining for these protected habitats. So half are performing poorly, and at least half are on a downward trajectory. In relation to our species, about 1/3 of our protected species are of inadequate or bad status. They're all meant to be at good status. That's what the policy dictates. From our bird species, about 20% of our protected species have a decreasing trend. So these are our protected sites, protected habitats. What about our non-protected habitat sites? We don't know, because we don't have accurate data in relation to maps or accurate data in relation to the species. So that ecological policy is not performing very well in this regard. So thus, it's becoming increasingly important that agricultural policy, if we want to protect biodiversity, agricultural policy has an important role to play. Last CAP, we saw greening and the introduction of ecological focus areas, or retention of habitat, shall we say. And how has that performed? Well, there were a number of evaluations by the European Court of Auditors, and many of these evaluations, the chief one about 2 years ago, was pretty critical in relation to the performance of the CAP. So I'm not blaming farmers, I'm blaming more policy in this regard, and it indicated that greening has led to very limited change in farming practices. So regardless of the measures being implemented by landowners, if the measure is a poor measure or is not designed correctly, then it's not going to perform well. Also, another criticism from the European Court of Auditors at an EU scale, but incorporating Ireland as well, is that member states aimed to limit the burden on farmers and on themselves rather than trying to maximise environmental benefit. So that's greening. What about the CAP? Well, again, about 2 years ago, the European Court of Auditors had another evaluation, this time of the CAP, and it said most CAP funding has had little positive impact on biodiversity. And then a smaller report indicated that the EU framework for pollinators as part of the CAP has had little impact in affecting their decline. So against this backdrop, the UN report, again on global assessment, came up with some recommendations that could be considered for more sustainable agricultural practices, looking at things like incorporation of more integrated pest and nutrient management, looking at elements such as organic agriculture or agroecology. And I'm not saying organic agriculture is necessarily better for biodiversity, but it can have benefits for below ground diversity, or it can have benefits for water quality. Looking at things like soil or water conservation practices, looking at agroforestry or silvopastoral systems, so incorporating more trees into the main paddocks, and also a key one from a biodiversity point of view. So the first 4 have kind of knock-on implications for biodiversity. A key one for biodiversity is managing biodiversity beyond those designated sites where it's already doing poorly, but managing it also in our more intensively managed systems. So these EU and UN strategies resulted in design of new policies and new strategies. About 3 years ago, we saw people floating this EU Green Deal, which was trying to incorporate elements of the EU biodiversity strategy, so biodiversity on one hand, and the farm to fork strategy, or agricultural strategy on the one hand. Looking at some key elements that they were trying to achieve within these EU Green Deals are reduction in chemical pesticide use by 50% between now and 2030, incorporating more organic land in our system, so 25% of agricultural land to be organic at an EU scale. So Ireland is starting off a very low base, so we'll never achieve that 25% by 2030, but to increase the trajectory. Looking at a reduction in the use of fertilisers, for example, and from a biodiversity point of view, one of the key policies and objectives here was to try and retain 10% landscape features, so 10% of our farming systems to be dedicated towards biodiversity, and also to reverse the declines in pollinators. More recently, as these were only strategies, more recently we're seeing new restoration policy, so nature restoration policy, which is trying to give some legal binding to these original objectives within these strategies. Also, we've seen the same. About a week before Christmas, we had COP15, which is the UN Biodiversity Conference, the lesser-loved brother of COP26, which is the Climate Change Conference. But again, some of the key strategies that we already are looking to incorporate on an EU scale, the COP is looking to try and roll that out further afield. So we're now seeing greater and greater policy integration. Biodiversity is dependent on agriculture. Agriculture is dependent on biodiversity. So there is a need for greater integration of these biodiversity and agricultural strategies. And we've seen some of this now happening in the latest CAP, in the latest Common Agricultural Policy. So biodiversity strategy and farm to fork have given a roadmap, and the CAP strategic plan is getting onto that road, and there's a way to go yet. But some of the key elements are to foster a smart and competitive, resilient agricultural system, looking at supporting and strengthening environmental protection, including biodiversity. So one of the first times biodiversity has been included in one of the key objectives of the CAP, and also to strengthen the socio-economic fabric of rural areas. So we are now seeing, with each iteration of the CAP, we're seeing enhanced focus and enhanced ambitions from a biodiversity point of view. So what does it look like? How is it likely to impact agricultural systems? Well, we're familiar with the CAP. 2 pillars. Pillar 1, looking at direct payments, basic payments, eligibility, things like that, sectoral interventions, and Pillar 2, which was looking more at rural development, so our agri-environment schemes and things like that. About 10 million being dedicated towards this over the next 4 or 5 years, most of it coming from the EU, about 25% coming from national exchequer. So there are significant resources within the CAP, and as CAP deals with nearly all agricultural land, there's significant potential from a biodiversity point of view. So the indication is that about 75% of all expenditure on biodiversity in Ireland is associated with agricultural expenditure. Within the CAP, we have 3 core elements that can play a role from a biodiversity point of view. Conditionality, sitting on top of that, so this is for all farmers in receipt of basic payments. Sitting on top of that is eco-schemes, and then we have our climate and environmental intervention sitting on top of those. Crudely, you could say that there are opportunities from a biodiversity point of view to enhance habitat quantity within our eco-schemes and conditionality, and quality within our climate and environmental interventions. So, Pillar 1, conditionality, basic requirements for farmers in receipt of CAP payments. Things like our good agricultural and environmental condition. Our GAC measure 8, for example, looking at landscape features, played an important role in ensuring the retention of these landscape features throughout the system. They are now looking at a minimum share for biodiversity, minimum share space for nature, targeted at 4%. Eco-scheme, Pillar 1, again sitting on top of this, aims to build on conditionality. Space for nature now moves towards 7% or 10%. Other options within the eco-schemes looking at planting of native trees and hedgerows and looking at additional environmental measures. So what does our space for nature actually mean, and what does it look like? So we've put 3 levels, as I said. So DAFM, our Department of Ag, have been pretty ambitious in this regard. We've moved away from the EU in this place, whereas the EU was looking at tillage systems initially and more or less exclusively. DAFM have ambitiously included tillage and grassland systems. There are efforts, as we see a grading here, there's efforts to reward those farmers that deliver most habitats, for example, 4, 7 and 10%. But some of the criticisms or some of the challenges that could be associated, are these thresholds sufficiently ambitious? We don't fully know yet, but indications from the department and articles that are written in the media would suggest that over 90% of farmers, 92% I think it is, has over 10% of their area already dedicated as space for nature, and about 5% have between 7 and 10. So most farmers are exceeding this. So on the one hand, you could say, well, it's great that Irish farmers are being recognised for the existing habitats they already have and that they're exceeding these thresholds. Now, the challenge is, when that happened previously, the Court of Auditors said, well, this eco-scheme is resulting in very little additionality. What are we getting for our 25% expenditure that we weren't already getting? So that's one of the challenges. Another challenge is 90% of farmers, as we said, are exceeding this 10%. Are we sufficiently rewarding those that exceed the 20%, or 30%, or 40%, or 50%? So that's one of the challenges. And another key one is the space for nature. Do the calculations reflect reality on the ground? I'm sure most of you will have seen on Ag Foods or on your own reports in relation to your farms, you are probably pleasantly surprised at the space for nature you have on your farm, be it for conditionality or eco-schemes. And some of this could be related to this thing called a weighting factor that certain habitats are getting and other habitats are not getting. So for example, our linear habitats like hedgerows and drains, because we don't have them mapped correctly for a width, they are giving a standard width of 10 metres. Now, in reality, the average width of a hedgerow is about 2 or 3 metres. So if you give an increased width like this or a weighting, there could be a flaw in the system. And an example of this is if we look at Curtin's Farm, and this is an old habitat map of Curtin Farm from about 4 years ago. Farm area is about 62 hectares, various different habitats, stone walls, hedgerows, grass banks, tree lines, field margins. And when I calculated the actual area, now things have improved since then, but when you calculated the actual area, it was at about 3.6%, falling below that 4% conditionality. The actual area. If you use the weighting factor being proposed by the department, you now see, because some of these linear habitats are now being increased, they aren't increasing. It's just that the weighting is increased. They are now above the 10% for the eco scheme. So this is about 3 or 4 years ago. I should state Curtin's Farm is above 3.5% now, so significant efforts have gone in relation to enhancing the habitat quantity and quality. An improvement that has been made is in relation to eligible habitats. So most farmers have habitats that were ineligible under previous iterations of the CAP. And we kind of view habitats, our policy view habitats in different ways. Some that are valued habitats, such as hedgerows, tree lines, drainage ditches, they were never X'd off your map. Some that were optionally valued, so you could remove them if you wanted, but you could also include them in an agri-environment scheme, so you could get payment for them through that. And then we had a variety of other habitats that are undervalued, that are just as important for biodiversity and water and carbon, but they were undervalued by policy. So the farmers were being penalised by having things like scrubs or ponds on their land. Now things have changed, and but previously when I did reviews of this, we could see on average about 7% of intensive farms had habitats, so about 7% of the farm area is habitat, and a large proportion of that were these ineligible habitats. So more recently we're seeing that being changed, that most of these habitats are going to be recognised because they play an important role in biodiversity. Another key element is quality, and there are opportunities to improve quality. So traditionally there was little focus on habitat quality within the CAP. A hedgerow that was short back and sides and overly managed, important to use a tillage one here just to not give a bad impression of dairy, was viewed as highly as the bottom picture here, which is better for biodiversity and better for carbon. And unsurprisingly, if we don't have policy to improve the quality of systems or reward those with the best quality, reviews of these hedgerows were frequently finding that the quality was typically low through either over-management or under-management. We're now seeing Pillar 2 opportunities for improved quality. Our acres scheme will have acres general, which is a variety of different kind of basic measures for about half the farmers in the scheme, but we're now moving towards these things called results-based payments. And where a results-based payment works is the better the quality of your habitat, the higher the delivery of your ecosystem service, the higher your payment. And we've long experience of results-based approaches in this country. They are locally led, they are farmer-driven approaches. Farmers, scientists, advisors and other experts collaborate to develop new practices that are environmentally friendly and economically sustainable. So here's a picture of a EIP in North Cork, so the Bride project. We've about so this slide is a little bit old. We've about 40 different EIPs. Not all of them focus on more extensive systems. We've also got EIPs, farmer-led, engaging with stakeholders, looking at more intensive systems as well. So that's some of the challenges from a biodiversity point of view. But we have significant challenges then from a sustainability point of view. How do you strike a balance between economic, societal and environmental outcomes or environmental concerns? All of these are demands on our land. How do we meet the challenge associated with these sustainability needs? Meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. So the kind of the three legs of our sustainability stool being propped up by economic, environmental and societal sustainability. And different farming systems, different farming enterprises face different sustainability challenges. The sustainability challenges for maybe a lowland dairy farm are going to be very different from the sustainability challenges associated with an upland sheep farm. Another key challenge is policy coherence. We have a suite of different policies and strategies. I mentioned the biodiversity strategy. We're also seeing climate strategy in meetings yesterday in relation to climate action plan. Aoife will probably mention water quality strategies and water quality policies. We have our food vision and our production policies. And we have many other different policies, all competing for the same space, all impacting on landowners, resulting in a very complex policy environment. And whilst there may be synergies between certain policies to deliver multiple ecosystem services, on occasion there's going to be trade-offs, where one ecosystem service comes at the cost of another. And that may be between economic cost and environmental, or even within environmental, it may be drivers to enhance maybe carbon sequestration, could have knock-on negative implications from a biodiversity point of view. So the challenges from a comprehensive and complex policy situation is there's conflicting and competing policies that farmers try to navigate through. There's changing policies, so each iteration of the CAP results in slightly different policy change. There's short-term strategies, so payments under agri-environment schemes only last 4 or 5 years. What happens after that? And then there's policy ambitions. Some policies are more ambitious and more effective than others. So these are significant challenges that impact on landowners. But there's also opportunities that we need to start exploring a little bit more. So we focused a lot on what policy is doing and the amount of funding that policy is directing towards biodiversity. But there's an opportunity for market to play a role here, to complement and add value to public payments. The advantage of this is that you can kind of enhance public perception of farmers. If we start looking and setting thresholds from a biodiversity or water or carbon, we can demonstrate whether we're delivering high quality milk or meat or grain, whilst also retaining water quality and retaining 10% of our habitats or something like that. You could look towards looking at paying a premium for the produce. We get premia already for milk or meat or grain, depending on the quality. Why shouldn't we be getting premia on our product, on our farm product, if it is also delivering biodiversity or carbon or water? And I know you'll say, okay, cost of living is increasing, people won't pay a premium. Well, we've never really explored it in this country. We've had 30 years of agri-environment schemes, but you could never buy an agri-environment milk or an agri-environment meat. And anyway, if the market or if the public aren't willing to pay it, well, there's other avenues that we can start looking at. And what are the other approaches that we could explore? Well, we could explore green loans, for example. And typically it's being used currently for something like energy. But the green loan principle lists biodiversity as an eligible criteria and an eligible use of these proceeds. So why not have green loans reduced interest rates associated with those who achieve a certain threshold from a biodiversity point of view? Or looking at integrated approaches. Why not have a green loan and a premium? And this has been explored by Rabobank and elsewhere in Friesland Campina in the Netherlands, where landowners in these pilot schemes are now becoming more mainstreamed, get a green loan and a premium once they reach certain biodiversity objectives. So as a summary, agriculture is the dominant land use in Ireland and the EU. Nature conservation is dependent on farmers, on farm-scale efforts, which will be guided by effective policy and implementation and will depend on ongoing farmer engagement. Farms differ, landscapes differ, biodiversity challenges differ, responses will differ, advice differs. One size does not fit all. The message being delivered to this room will differ than the message being delivered to a beef conference, for example, or to an upland sheep conference. So one size does not fit all. But the same principles still exist. So we need to try and retain habitat quantity, improve habitat quality, and ensure habitat diversity. We have a complex policy environment. We need greater coherence between agri-environment, so agricultural and environmental policies. And we need to start valuing the ecosystem services being delivered by farmers. There's a current kind of strategy that society wants farm produce for cheap and environmental produce for free. And we can't really work on that basis. So we need to explore markets, we need to explore policies and ensure that big business and financial are also coming on board to ensure their sustainability objectives can be aligning with some of the sustainability objectives from agriculture. Sin sin, míle buíochas.
Good, Darra. While we change over there, I'll just fire one question towards you. This morning I went on agfood.ie and you brought that up there about the space for nature, and I checked and it's over 18% for my own farm. And you know, I should be jumping around the place saying, geez, I've some great habitats and aren't I doing a great job? But you and I have mapped our farm and we know that that figure is actually closer to 8%. So is it fair to say that most of those figures are at a minimum 10% inflated, those space for nature figures maybe in or abouts?
So they are, anywhere there's linear habitats, they are inflated. And I can understand why the department had to do this, because we don't have good habitat maps or national land cover maps. So when they're mapping hedgerows on your farm, they only had linear length. So you had to give it a standard width. Now, a standard width of 10 metres is an extreme standard width, considering you're not allowed to have a hedge that's wider than 4 metres under the previous policy. So somewhere in between the current average, which was about 2.5 metres, or even if you extended it to 5%, is more realistic. Because I think basically it's not going to fly at the EU scale. At some stage, the EU will say, well, actually, this isn't reality. So it's kind of unfair to landowners that they're giving an inflated situation at the minute, when it doesn't really, it's not really needed. On average, intensive dairy farmers have about 6 or 7% without giving any weighting factor already on their land.
Thanks for that.